Hello, and thanks for attending our webinar. We're going to be talking today about threat intelligence and the C-suite and how threat intelligence can benefit the organization as well as the board, and that there's a good way to use threat intelligence at that level, and how you can evaluate the threat intelligence to determine if it's valid and good and a good source, and then the benefits that you'll get from it. My name is Dan McWhorter. I'm our VP and Chief Intelligence Strategist at FireEye, and joining us will be Richard Turner, the President of EMEA for FireEye, and we'll be talking about these things today. So to get started, Richard will be here shortly and will join in. Let's talk a little about the key challenges that really face both executives and CISOs when it comes to threat intelligence and how to use it within their organization. One of the big problems that you always have inside of an organization is really, judging the competing budgets that you get and the requests that come in. And of course, in order to show that an investment's the right one, you want to have some sort of empirical data or strong justification for the fact that that's going to bring benefit to the organization and that the cost is going to be justified. Another is that, the amount of intelligence that's produced, especially at the tactical and operational level, is so varied and so much of it comes without any context. So it's giant streams of information that has little tied to it for you to ground the conclusions to something within your organization in order to make it valuable, and to tie the conclusions that come from that intelligence to things that you want to do within your enterprise or within your organization. And also, a lot of the intelligence that comes is poorly sourced or poorly explained, so you don't really know where those nuggets of information came from and why the conclusions were made that were made. So without that understanding of where the sourcing is and where it comes from, it's difficult to assign a trust value to that intelligence. And of course, all intelligence is a mixture of fact and assessment. And the assessment piece always carries with it, some level of risk that it isn't true or it isn't accurate or that we didn't get the right conclusion. So good intelligence is always backed by a confidence value, some explanation of how likely it is that the conclusion that was made was true. If it was fact, it wouldn't be intelligence. So intelligence is taking a bunch of data and a bunch of facts and stringing them together into an assessment. And as you take jumps along the way of creating that assessment, you're of course introducing risk that you might be wrong. And when you report on intelligence, you need to use some sort of a gauge or language, confidence language, to explain the likelihood of your assessment being correct. And good intelligence always has that right next to it. And so often the reports we get today don't have that. So between the mixture of having so much of it, not knowing where the intelligence came from or why, having it be short and without additional information, having it not explained with a confidence value so that you know how much to trust it or to consider it, that makes receiving intelligence close to worthless. And so that's one of the big challenges today facing, I think, both the execs, the C-suite, and the board is we can get our hands on intelligence, but not only do we not know how to use it, but we don't know how to interpret the intelligence we received and how much confidence to put into it. And then finally, the last is, really the cyber risk and how to translate the threat intelligence into some level of risk or some level of action or some level of movement. And that's a very difficult process. Oftentimes you receive information, you may understand, the likelihood that it's true and accurate, and you may even see the applicability to your organization, but then to translate that into something, whether it be communication to the appropriate people that need to understand that risk, that threat intelligence, or it's developing an action plan. Both of those are very difficult. And if you're not practiced in translating intelligence into action, it's a very difficult process, even for things that are very obvious. If you go back into even very simple things like, fire, actions and reactions, and you might have your children that you would train and say, well, if there's a fire, here's what I want you to do. The reason you practice that and train it is because you may have information that a fire's there, that a fire's coming, that there's something going on in the house. But if you haven't practiced translating that into action, it's actually a little bit of a difficult step. And threat intelligence is even worse because you have these confidence values where you don't quite know if something's true, you don't quite know the scope, you may not have the complete picture. That's why it's intelligence. But yet you still have some inkling, some start of information that you really should be acting on, or at least thinking about how you will react, and translating that into an action plan is very difficult. So those are some of the big challenges of taking threat intelligence and really making it usable within your organization.
Yeah, Dan, if I can just chime in there.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Rich Turner. I'm the president of EMEA for FireEye. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that Dan's made there, and then expand on them, over the next few slides. I think, one of the key areas for me, and one of the things that very frequently comes up in meetings with executives and boards with companies is, we spend an awful lot of money on security. We open the newspapers and see lots of businesses still being compromised, lots of successful attacks. The scale of the attacks is not going down. The impact of the attacks, both in terms of that organization and also the economy overall, is going up. There doesn't seem to be a very good economic story around our security investments. And so, intelligence becomes incredibly important for organizations in order to allow them to really focus on, the threats which are most relevant to them, and to do so in a way which most appropriately, meets their appetite for risk, the regulatory environment or legal jurisdiction that they operate in. And we are increasingly moving towards that sort of intelligence-led security strategy. As Dan's already said, there is a deluge of information. So trying to understand what the right kind of intelligence or what sources of intelligence that you need and whether it serves your purpose, I think is really key. And then for those of you who've dialed in from the UK, if you've read the most recent report from I think it's the National Crime Agency, it's just been issued. They talk about, the boards of, our companies, still not yet really understanding, the risk to their business of cyber. And, not all intelligence does this, but if you're procuring and sourcing the right kinds of intelligence, some of that intelligence really ought to be, business level, contextualized information that helps you understand how to communicate and how to position the risks that are most relevant to your organization, to your board, in a way that they're then able to start to understand what the right, steps, strategies, investments, et cetera, are that they should be investing in order to take the most appropriate, cybersecurity stance. The fact is that, there's clearly best practices, but there's no sort of de facto security strategy that is right. It's very much based on each business, their threat environment, the threats that they're most likely to be exposed to, the groups that are most likely to target them, the techniques that they're most likely to use, their appetite for risk, the regulatory environment that they're in, that they're so on. And so there remains a certain amount of customization that's critical to their strategy, and intelligence is key in being able to inform that strategy and make it really relevant for their business in a way that's economic for the organization overall. So if we want to think about how organizations can leverage intelligence, just sort of expanding on those themes a little bit, in no particular order, one of the first ones, one of the most important ones is really being able to prioritize risk, really understand the groups that might target you, why they might target you, the techniques that they might use, the kind of things that they might take, et cetera, whether they're active or not, and all of those sorts of things, much less sort of bits and bytes type kind of IOC stuff, and much higher level, intel that allows you to really prioritize your risk, because this is a key driver, of your security investment. Can help you communicate risk threats and response strategies through and to your board. Allows you to assess the risk of new initiatives. If you're a company, or business who's in M&A or is doing mergers and acquisitions, being able to understand the threats that might be relevant to an acquisition target that you're making, the industry that acquisition target is in, or the geography that they're in, or what have you, is potentially very powerful in not only potentially completing a transaction and trying to identify whether in fact that organization may already be compromised, but also informing the first phases of the security strategy that you might likely want to put in place, having completed that transaction. Obviously, planning budgets and staffing. Now, skills are really hard to get hold of, and budgets are, unnecessarily tight. The security spend overall continues to grow, but as I said earlier, one of the things that we increasingly get feedback from senior executives and boards is, we're spending all this money, and security spend over the last 5 years has grown 3 or 4-fold. But the reality is that the threats not contained, breaches continue to happen, breaches continue to be bigger and more expensive, and so on. And so, being able to target the skills that you need to invest in budgeting and drive the strategy for the organization based, as I say, on this intelligence to make sure that you've got the skills that you need, that they are fully aligned and appropriate for your particular environment, that you're budgeting in a way that makes sense for your organization. And certainly our view is that the constant growth of spend in security without the corresponding success rates against attacks is a kind of an inequitable story there, and the industry and intelligence in particular has the potential to really impact the way that you spend. And then the last area, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is executive comms. Briefing the executives so that they can, make business level decisions about security strategy, response readiness, response strategies, and so on. But also to ensure that, in the event that something really bad happens and they find themselves, in the media, that they are conversant with, the environment that your organization is operating in, and are able to kind of be a spokesperson and a commentator for the business from a position of knowledge, from being informed. So we talk a little bit more about each of these areas. And if you think about risk prioritization, put simply, this is really about helping to protect your organization against its most damaging threats. And if you look at the way most businesses invest in security, it's not true of every organization, but most businesses invest in security in a fairly horizontal fashion. And what we mean by that is that they typically spend about the same amount of money to protect their most valuable digital assets, as they do information that's ultimately going to become public domain anyway. Press releases, prior to publication, receive almost the same amount of security dollars to protect them as organizations' most important information and most valuable digital assets, and that really doesn't make a lot of sense. Equally, there's a tendency to try and protect an organization from every single threat if you can't kind of coordinate your investments against the risks that are known as a consequence of understanding, who is targeting your industry sector, from where to where kind of companies and so on. We can by leveraging intelligence, we can help do that, and the security operations can help do that in an organization. It can help determine the information assets most at risk. If we know who the groups are, the methods they're likely to use, the information that they're likely to target, it can help us to start invest in the stuff which is most at risk and most valuable. You then need to be able to get access in order to be successful with this, threat analysis, which is customized for your industry or your enterprise, and threat diagnostics, which identify your organization's threat sources, assets that they target, and how they exploit stolen assets. Because even when you've been breached, the best recovery strategies also have a component in them which is designed to minimize stakeholder impact, particularly customer impact. And a great example, if you think about the TalkTalk disclosure last year, I think it was, the organization, one of a small number of industries, two only in the UK required to disclose. They disclosed, and unfortunately, there was immediately a sort of a rash of follow-on crimes targeting consumers, masquerading to be people calling from TalkTalk, to try and take over their computers, install malware, charge fees, steal credentials, et cetera, et cetera. And so, being able to understand, how these groups work, what they're targeting, and how they exploit them can also help you minimize stakeholder impact in the event of a successful attack by doing a better job of protecting and communicating to your consumers or your customers who may be impacted. I talked a little bit about risk assessment of new initiatives, whether that's expanding into a new market, moving into a new industry, embracing or launching a new technology. Intelligence can be helpful, in understanding the environment of that market, region, industry, technology, whatever it is that you're moving into, and can also give the ability to get access to, custom queries, specific targeted information about, hey, we're thinking about doing this, we're thinking about moving into this industry, we're thinking about moving into this market. What kind of groups operate in this space? What kind of who do they target? How do they target them? Et cetera, et cetera. So you can make fully informed decisions. You can make sure that if investment in security is required for a successful, to post-transaction, in order for that to be successful, you can make sure that it's appropriately, sized and communicated in those early programmatic phases of that business initiative, as opposed to trying to tag it on the end. The same is true of exiting an industry. We tend to find that cyber activity kind of follows the real news. Here we are in the UK post the referendum, where we've decided to leave the European Union. Whatever your view on that, the reality is that organizations with interests in the UK are likely to target the UK in a more focused fashion over the next sort of several months to try and harvest intelligence that might help them protect their interests, whether they have, interests in the UK or dependency to the UK. And cyber threat intelligence is important to understand how that dynamic environment is changing and evolving. And we see different groups obviously targeting different types of organizations in different regions. We're perennially talking about the pressure on budgets and actually even more so the availability of skills. And intelligence can play a critical role in really helping you, assess your current security programs, the technologies that you've got, the type and amount of staffing or resources that you have to allow you to kind of protect yourselves or minimize the impact of current and emerging threats. And that's particularly critical in an environment where skills are difficult to get hold of. You want to make sure that you've got the skills that are relevant to your particular environment and the threat environment that your organization operates in. It can help you identify cost-effective countermeasures to threats. A lot of security actually can be achieved with, without too much money. I think if we talk about, putting in place a proper process in organizations and creating a kind of a compliance-based culture, and I don't mean compliance in the sense of meeting a regulation, but if you look at today's treasury attacks, which have been on the rise over the last 12 to 15 months, along with ransomware, a compliance regime that would cause an individual to question a request that purports to be from a CEO or a CFO, to transfer a large sum of money to an alternative, to a bank account, a compliance-based regime around that would have steps and processes in place to make sure that that is appropriately queried and verified before it's taken place. So that's what we mean really by this sort of compliance-based policy. And a good intelligence model can help you make sure that you're investing in those processes, building the right processes and compliance models for your security. And that can have a significant effect on the amount of dollars spent, in order to counteract some of the most significant threats, some of the most significant threats out there. And we really do believe that an investment in intelligence is a way of getting better leverage from the rest of your security investments if you can translate that into a more effective strategy. And lastly, in this section, executive communications. And, as I said, the National Crime Agency of the UK just recently produced a report, saying that boardroom awareness still wasn't high enough. I probably spend more time in boardrooms, today than I have done in any of the previous sort of 15 or 18 years that I've been in the cybersecurity industry. And I can tell you that, and I'm sure this is something that you would all echo, that actually executive level of awareness is higher than it's ever been. Is it where we would ideally like it to be in every business? I think the answer to that is also is probably no. And I think as practitioners, we have a great responsibility of making sure that the business and the stakeholders of value for our shareholders, whether they be the employees, customers, or what have you, that they are educated in the appropriate way with materials that mean which mean something to possibly not an internet generation individual, et cetera, et cetera. So, with the right kind of intelligence tools can help you, as a security practitioner, contextualize the headlines and explain to, your executives and your board whether, what we're seeing in the current headlines, are relevant to us. If an attack that's been publicized, is likely to affect, your organization, whether a group that's uncovered is likely to be a threat to your organization, can help you understand and communicate, how you're responding to current incidents, and help explain how you're preparing to counter emerging threats. So you can see across these at least 4 areas how an effective strategy around cyber intelligence and making sure you're sourcing the right kind of intelligence from the right kind of places can help you improve your security strategy, the education of your board, help mitigate risk, and ultimately reduce the cost, not just of your security in the first place, but potentially of an attack, in the event that it's successful. And I think that's really the era of security that we're starting to move into. Is how do we drive a stronger ROI from security investments and making sure that they're appropriate and relevant to the environment that your organization operates in, because there really is not one size fits all.
So let me step in here, Rich. I think everything you said is just spot on. And Rich had asked me to come and comment a little on how can I tell if this is good intelligence or not. I spoke at the beginning and just said that it's really difficult to tell with the deluge of intel we get today. What should I pay attention to? What shouldn't I? What's a good source? And so I get that question a lot. My history is I created and ran the Mandiant FireEye Intelligence unit. I've been with Mandiant about 10 years, and then with the acquisition, took over the FireEye Intelligence side and was integral in the iSight acquisition to join their intelligence with the company as well. So I have a lot of background in actually generating intelligence and then trying to make it useful to our customer set as well as our internal consultants. So, I'm thinking about that question. I get asked it a lot. I really focus mostly on 3 core things. The first thing that I always go to, which I had talked to you guys about a little bit earlier, was the visibility and the sourcing. And I use visibility instead of sourcing because sourcing sometimes can sound more complicated than it is. And so I think visibility sometimes is a better word to describe. When you look at an organization that's producing intelligence, you want to think about what is it they can see? Because if they can't see it, their intelligence is likely not good. You know, I equate that to if someone came and told you there's a guy in our neighborhood and this guy's breaking into houses and he's doing it by climbing in the basement window, you know, my question to that person would be, how do you know that? You know, what have you seen? You know, do you have access to police records? Do you have access to other neighbors? Are you a reporter who's going in and asking people? Are you a neighbor who actually saw this happen? And depending upon what their visibility is, gives me an idea of how much I should trust it. In our world today, when it comes to cyber intelligence, this is a very appropriate question to ask, and oftentimes you'll be very shocked by the answer you get. I was talking to an Israeli startup who was telling me how they like to go into chat rooms and go into forums and pretend to be other people and try to get intelligence. And I was happy with that. That's fine. That's a reasonable way to get intelligence. But then their next statement was, this is how they're collecting intelligence on like the North Korean government and on the Chinese government and what they're doing. And, you know, those two didn't fit well together to me, because if you're a government and you're creating your own tools internal and you're paying people and you're doing attacks, you keep all that at a classified level. You don't go into a public forum and talk about trading your tools and things like that. So as they started to explain the things they claimed they knew, and then you map it to what their visibility was, there was an incongruity in what they were saying, and that instantly made me skeptical of their results. That happens a lot, and it's a very reasonable question for you to ask. If I were to leave FireEye and look to acquire an intelligence source, this is probably the one area I would apply the most scrutiny to, is if you can't explain to me why you have visibility that allows you to say what you do, I cannot trust your results. And it's a very fundamental idea, but it's not asked often enough. And when you do ask that question and really dig in, you'll be surprised sometimes what the visibility is, or how poorly the generator of the intelligence can actually explain where their visibility comes from. The second thing you always need to evaluate is the analysis. So I mentioned before that, what intelligence isn't fact. Reporting facts is a reporting thing. It's a telling you what we know. And that's a very good thing too. But true intelligence comes from taking all the data, all the facts that you have, and then taking that next jump. And when you take that next jump, it's called an assessment. And that's you taking all the facts in assessing what you believe to be true. And the quality at which you do that assessment is highly, it highly impacts how believable or how likely true your results are. And so, some people take a whole lot of facts and then make a jump based upon those facts. And they do it in a very scientific, rigorous way. They appropriately describe where they've taken jumps and what their confidence level is in those. And then when you get the results, you can understand very clearly, I believe with a high level of confidence or with a moderate level of confidence that such and such is true. But some folks take all of those facts and they make jumps that are sort of not scientific. The way that they've pulled together the facts, their brain is going in a totally different direction, and they let themselves go that direction instead of being rigorous. And then even worse is when they do that, they take a big jump, but they never tell you that. So you as the reader or consumer of the intelligence never gets told, hey, at this spot I had to take a pretty big jump, just so you know it, and you can factor that into my results. They never report that back. So that's a very bad thing, obviously, because you don't understand where they've taken jumps and how big the jumps are. And so one of the things I always suggest, there's ways to do this. When you look at people's intelligence, you can look for, as I mentioned before, confidence language. If they're not describing somewhere along the way how confident they are in the result, then you have real problems, because that means they're assuming with 100% confidence they're right, or they're trying to hide to you how confident they are. Or they don't even know that they should be reporting the confidence, which is even worse. So at some point in their analysis, you should be getting a lot of feeling for this is how strongly we believe this. It's completely appropriate for them to report back to you something they have very low confidence in. That's okay. That's actually good. It's good for you to know everything that's going on, provided they tell you they have low confidence in it. What you don't want is to be getting that information and have no idea that it's a low confidence assessment. And then sort of the third place is really, there's no sense having intelligence if you don't do something with it. So, you got to have, and I mentioned this earlier, you got to have a way to do something with it. If you just use intelligence to get smarter over and over and over again, but never turn that, becoming smarter into action, it's really not that useful to you. Now, it's okay to build up some level of fact and awareness and to keep building that for an eventual time where you might need to take action. That's not what I'm saying. That's perfectly fine. But really, you got to ask yourself, like, in order to justify the spend and really to get the value out of intelligence, what are we doing with it? And if your answer is, really not much, I don't see it impacting us strategically, I don't see it impacting us tactically or operationally, then it's not doing you a lot of value. And so the trick to making what Richard described as the benefits of intelligence, he's spot on. Those are all the benefits. But the trick comes in, how do I then turn that intelligence into something I do, whether it's a briefing, whether it's an awareness, whether it's a change of how we're positioning resources, whether it's a change in how we're protecting a certain segment of the network. Whatever it is you're doing with the intelligence, you got to make sure you do something with it. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really something you have to practice. If you don't practice it, you don't push it, you'll find, without even knowing it, that you've moved to a model where you're really just consuming intelligence to get smarter. And that's not the best place to be. And it's something you got to constantly strive for and keep asking. And even me on my side, when I'm running our intelligence teams, I got to keep going back to our team and saying, like, are you telling the reader this because you want them to just be smarter? Or, you want them to know more about China? Do you want them to know more about, this situation? Or are you telling that to them because there's something they should really be thinking about doing? And if there's something they should be thinking about doing, we have to articulate that in our intelligence. And that's something you need to practice as an organization. So, as far as FireEye goes, I wanted to explain a little bit of where, we fit within these three models. And when it comes to the visibility side, excuse me one sec. When it comes to the visibility side, we really have a pretty unique visibility. And if you don't mind just listening to our story for a little bit, I'd appreciate it. Our intelligence really comes from three primary sources. The first source is FireEye. So FireEye started, about 10 years ago, and their technology has these virtual machines in it. And these virtual machines get built into almost all of our detection capabilities. And what that does is those virtual machines get spread all throughout an enterprise, whether you're putting it on the network or you're putting it on the host or you're putting it on a mobile device. When these things identify badness, they report back to a cloud. And what we have is a broad distribution of these virtual machines in the dozens of millions of these virtual machines spread throughout the world. And so FireEye has a source of intelligence coming back that we call telemetry, which really just gives us a good idea of what's going on where. And this isn't an entirely unique capability. So there's quite a few corporations that have a cloud of intelligence. So they have an intelligence they have some sort of sensors broadly deployed across the world. But there's not a lot of organizations that have this type of visibility. So, some of the larger ISPs, some of the larger security companies might have this type of intelligence. It's a very good intelligence to have because you can understand who's attacking where, which regions get hit, which industries are getting hit, what's hot, what's not. That's a fantastic source of intelligence, but it's not entirely unique. The second set of visibility that we have comes from the Mandiant acquisition. And what Mandiant's best known for is really being the world's leader in incident response. So when companies get breached, Mandiant comes and helps that company. They come inside the company. They sit in a war room with the executives and with the technical team trying to solve the questions of the breach, which are how did they get in, what did they steal, where did they go, what tools did they use, how can we recognize the attacker, how can we kick the attacker out, how can we keep it from happening. And so, probably if you look back over a 10-year window and took every major headline about a breach and put the company's name or organization's name on a piece of paper, Mandiant probably did 90% of those incident responses. We're really the team behind the scenes that doesn't often get mentioned, although we're mentioned more often in the last few years than we were in the early years. But The reason from an intelligence standpoint this matters is that we're getting visibility that truly is unique. You know, I mentioned that the telemetry visibility is somewhat unique, but there are large organizations that get a good idea. There's really no other organization in the world that gets this kind of information, including government organizations, because companies only invite select few to come into their network and fight the bad guys while they're fighting the fight. And so we get to see the bad guys typing on the command line. We get to see them move from one system to the next. We even get to understand very unique idiosyncrasies about how an attacker operates. Like this attacker likes to use the -P option when they use this command. We know that because we get to watch and we investigate what these bad guys are doing as they're moving system to system within a compromised network. So, you know, if you go to major breaches and you're the team that's responding to these attackers, you learn a lot about exactly how these attackers are working. And very, very few organizations get to see that, and no one gets to see it at the scale we get to see it at Mandiant. And then our third piece of visibility really comes from Eyesight Partners. And Eyesight Partners, we just acquired in 2016, the beginning of the year. They really have an unmatched, unparalleled visibility into non-victim data. So Mandiant is really expert at seeing inside the victim organization. What Eyesight has terrific visibility into is really the beginning and the end of the attack life cycle. So the attack life cycle normally starts at reconnaissance, and you say like, well, someone's doing reconnaissance, they're trying to find the victim, they're trying to figure out who the people are there, what they're doing, and then they attack the system, they get on, they escalate their privileges, they do the attack, they steal the data. What Eyesight gives us is really the step before reconnaissance. So we actually get to see the attackers build their tools. We get to see the attackers hire a botnet to come in and to give them access into systems. And then we get to see the very end. So after the data has been stolen, normally the story stops. But with Eyesight, we get to see the end of what are they doing with that data, how are they moving it, where are they going. And the way we get to see that is that we have, you know, a huge worldwide network of folks that are dedicated to collecting us information by getting into forums, by getting into the dark net, by following trends, by building tools to get information. That's really focused on understanding the attackers. And so we get this attacker intelligence from Eyesight, and we get the victim intelligence from Mandiant, we get telemetry intelligence from FireEye. The Eyesight intelligence that we get is truly unmatched from a commercial organization. Our level of spend, as far as the number of people we have and how broad our distribution are of people that are collecting information, is really equivalent to probably a top 5 intelligence agency and what they spend in human intelligence trying to get information on cybercrime and other cyber operations. So when we pair all three of those together, it makes for a pretty, I think, convincing argument that we have very good visibility of sourcing. And as I mentioned, that's a very critical question that you ask when you're thinking about intelligence. So the second piece that I talked about was really, the second piece I talked a little bit was about the quality of the analysis and the assessment that's going on. That's sometimes very difficult. You know, there's some telltale signs, like I mentioned, making sure good confidence language is used, making sure people explain how they move from one place to the next as they produce the intelligence. On our side, when we have to show our body of evidence, I always go back to our public reports and the level of scrutiny they get and how little negative feedback there is from our reporting. And that's because we're extremely precise with our language, we're extremely precise with the data we have, and we're precise with our assessments. And so, you know, even going back to Mandiant's APT1 report, if you look at that report, it was really the groundbreaking report for our industry. It wasn't that no one knew about APT1. People did. They commented about the comment crew. It's how succinctly and precisely we built our intelligence argument from open source information that China was in fact doing cyber espionage, economic espionage. And it's really that survived, and it's that allowed, you know, the U.S. State Department to go talk to China and to do sanctions and to do indictments against China. And it's being able to build that story in a cohesive way using sound intelligence principles. That was the power of APT1. It wasn't that we discovered APT1. People have been talking about APT1 or Comet Crew for a long time. It's the fact that we built the argument. We took all the visibility we had, which was unique to everybody else, and we built it into a strong intelligence statement. And that's what made that report powerful. If you go back and look at our other reports, which you may or may not be familiar with, but whether, the red line drawn paper that we just put out a few weeks ago about China's hacking and how we've seen a decrease in some of the economic espionage that they're committing, while still seeing a consistent level of cyber espionage from a military and standpoint. It is all baked into that report, and people read the report, and there's really been no negative takeaways from those reports. So I think when you look at our public reports, it gives you a strong understanding of what good intelligence looks like and what good assessment looks like. Finally, the last thing I was just going to talk about was, how to use the intelligence and the way that you use it. And, our intelligence, whenever we package it, we really, focus on, the three areas which we consider to be strategic, operational, and tactical. Strategic, most people understand, big picture, high level. Operational is more like what you do on a day-to-day basis, and then tactical is more like what you need to do at a pinpoint or at a precise moment, or particular steps you're taking. And so our intelligence gets packaged for all three. We specifically package intelligence for the C-suite and for executives, and of course that looks very different than the way that we package intelligence for the operational employees. So we really believe that, with good intelligence, you get a better strategy, you get stronger operational efficiency, and you get a better tactical response. And if you're not getting that, you're either not using the intelligence right, or you're not being given intelligence that's good. And, you do need to assess within your own organization which of those situations you're in. In most cases, it's a combination. And, of course, we have solutions that we can help you. We have intelligence solutions where we can come in and actually help you figure out how you're using intelligence. One of the case studies, I like to give is right after the ransomware attack started hitting, the very first attack that was the largest that everyone talked about, we actually did the incident response for. So we went into that environment, and we quickly saw that the attackers were very intentional in what they did. They got into that environment, they quickly found the file store, but not only did they find the file store, they looked in the same network for the backups. And what they did is they immediately deleted all the backup data, and then they deleted the primary data, or at least made it unreadable, and then threw the ransom down on this hospital and said, hey, if you want your data back, pay for it. Well, we took that and we produced intelligence from that we went back and said, this is actually observational data, not even intelligence. This is fact. We saw the attackers do this through observation. We took that, and then you would go to other hospitals and you'd carry that with you, and then you'd eventually ask the question, like, what did you do with that intelligence? And, they're sort of like, well, it was good intelligence. It was nice to learn about the attackers. And you sort of ask the question, did any of you take your backups and move them off of the primary network? And, you consistently get sort of blank stares. And it's like, look, you're not using the intelligence we gave you. You used the intelligence to feel like you got smarter on the attacker. What you should have done is taken that intelligence and said, what did I learn from it? I learned that this attacker looks for the backups in the primary network. And storing your backups in your primary network is completely logical. It's something that's been advocated for, or at least accepted for years. Because, the belief was, well, you can always get access to it and then restore things that you need to restore. It's no big deal. But as we find with these ransomware guys, anything networkly connected to the network, they were going to look for the data and destroy. So, the logical conclusion was, I better get my backups off that primary network onto some other segmented network so that if this guy destroys all my primary data, I have my backups. No one was doing that. And so, I laugh because it seems so obvious, but that's an example of, like, you have good intelligence. You have solid observational data of what happened, but you didn't take the action. And that's really something we try to focus on at FireEye, making sure that we're not just informing and getting folks smarter, but we're also, driving that action. Rich, I'll let you take over with the bottom line here. Still there, Rich?
Sorry, guys. The very quickly, because we're up on the time limit here. Intelligence is really all about identifying and prioritizing the risks that are most relevant to your organization, and being able to orientate your security strategy, your security investments, and educate your leadership around those challenges. We've talked a little bit about some of the sources of intelligence and FireEye's intelligence in particular. I also think it's important to point out that there are other sources of intelligence, and I mean less so kind of competitive vendors, but sources of intelligence that are within your communities of interest, I'll call them, your peers in your industry, the companies in your ecosystem or your supply chain. And, if we're going to kind of do a better job of addressing this issue, as a community going forward, then just better intelligence sharing overall is a key aspect of moving into these sort of safety in numbers type sort of security strategies, and much less these sort of strength in depth security strategies that most businesses have invested in over the last 10 to 15 years. So we had a couple of questions. I think, Dan, you've answered that. We have no other questions. So with that, thanks everybody for your time, and look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.